Hi, I'm Jean, and I'm going to be talking to you about classical education. I have known about classical education for approximately 3 months. So I am not an expert on it. So it may seem irresponsible for me to make a video about it, but I really wanted to get the conversation started with two different groups of people. So I'll explain a little bit about that. Um, I found out about Lutheran classical education when I was on a Lutheran homeschoolers page. I am not a full-time homeschooler. I do have three school-age kids at home with my husband, and um, I I am a public school teacher, but I was looking at for ideas for my kids at home. And somebody posted something in the homeschoolers group, and somebody responded, "Oh, you're going to want to go ask the folks in the classical Lutheran homeschoolers group." And I thought, well, what on earth does classical mean? So I looked into that and started to find out about classical Lutheran education. That there's are schools for this, but that also you can do it in the home. And I said to my husband, I think we need to give our kids a classical Lutheran education here at home. And he said, we are giving our kids a Lutheran education. And I said, I think it has to be classical. I think that's going to be better. And he said, well, what does that mean? And I said, I don't know. So I went back to the books and videos and learned some more. And then I came to him and I said, I think the kids have to learn Latin. And my husband has studied Latin and Spanish and German and Greek and Hebrew, and I've studied Latin and Spanish. So we both have Latin in our background. And my husband said, "Well, why would they have to learn Latin?" And I said, "I don't know." So I went back to the books and the videos and learned a lot about classical education from a Christian Lutheran standpoint, thinking about my children at home. Now, as a public school teacher, I'm always looking for also different things that I can do to improve my practice in the public school. Of course, not the Christian Lutheran perspective, but the what I could learn about classical education that could benefit me as a public school teacher as well. And then while I was looking into all of this in August, South Dakota's new proposed social studies standards came out. And I looked at them and I said, well, now these are very classical. And then there was the first hearing recently, and folks kept talking about classical education. And in the Brookings Register on Tuesday, September 20th, after the first hearing, I did listen to the entire hearing. By the way, I have a separate video about the social studies standards, so I'm not going to be talking about them here. It says in the Brookings Register on September 20th, Rachel Oglesby, who is Governor Kristi Noem's chief of policy, told the Board of Education Standards that she hoped the standards would bring the classical model to all the state's public schools. So I thought, wow, we're doing this, or we're possibly doing this. We're looking into doing this. So while I do not have a complete knowledge of classical education after my 3 months of study, I know more than probably most, unless except for the classical people who are watching this video. So I wanted to share with my fellow Lutherans about what I'd learned about the classical education, and I now especially want to share with my fellow public school teachers in South Dakota about what classical education is. I'm going to have to cannot advance my slide, so I'm going to have to minimize it, and let's start from here. Okay, now I've already told you quite a bit about my life. I told you that I am a public school teacher. I told you that I am a Lutheran. So please do not use any of that information against me to say that I'm teaching certain things and that I shouldn't be or anything like that. Let's be careful about straw man arguments as we listen to me trying my best to try to explain this. And also, if I say something kind of awkwardly, please make comments below so that I can clarify that. Again, I'm not a professional speaker, nor am I an expert on classical education. Please also make comments beneath to clear up any misconceptions I have, answer any questions that you think folks might have about anything I've said, suggest extra resources, those kinds of things. Please make those comments underneath the video on YouTube. These are the things that we're going to look at in this video. Okay, these are some things that classical education may include. So teaching young people to know and love the good, the beautiful, and the true, helping them to become wise, virtuous, and eloquent individuals and citizens. So they do not see education for utilitarian means. It's not what they call careerism. So they're not in education to prepare young people for what they're going to be when they grow up. They want them to become wise, virtuous, and eloquent individuals and citizens, parents, spouses, just preparing the whole person. It may include the great books, including those that don't align with one's own beliefs. So in a Veith and Kern book, which I'll show you a picture of in just a moment, on page 97, they say Western thought is characterized by ideas in conflict. So classical educators would say, we are not anti-intellectual. Yes, we have a point of view, but we want to also read from others who have other points of view. There's definitely a focus on Western civilization and culture, especially ancient Greece and Rome. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and then the writings of Plato and Aristotle, the languages of Latin and Greek. And I highlight Latin there because they talk about that a lot. They talk about teaching Latin in about 3rd grade, possibly before. They have different like kind of songs with Latin and stuff like that that are available for kids who are younger than 3rd grade, and then following up the teaching of Latin with the teaching of Greek. And then I'm just going to leave that point alone and let you look into that on your own. There are at least 5 reasons why I've seen that classical educators cite for the importance of teaching Latin to children. There's a focus not on the child's interest or on fun activities, but on what the child needs to know. So they don't start with the child and what he or she wants to do. They start with the body of knowledge that everybody should know in order to be wise, virtuous, and eloquent. So they start with that, and they teach that to all children. Classical education was the model used in U.S. schools until about the turn of the 20th century. They talk about things like modernism with John Dewey getting in there, and then followed by postmodernism. Also things like the introduction of electives, where different students are studying different things instead of there being a common body of knowledge that is studied by all students. All that kind of happening around the turn of the 20th century. We have each likely had fragments of classical education in our own education. So you might think, well, I studied that or something like that. But except for the classical people listening to this video, most of us were not classically educated. We did not receive a classical education. It includes or focuses on the 7 liberal arts, which are the trivium and quadrivium, which I'll explain in just a moment, and also the trivium as developmental stages in young people. The 7 liberal arts are the trivium and the quadrivium. So the trivium includes the language, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And the quadrivium includes the math and sciences. Arithmetic, which is the theory of number, and music theory, which is the application of the theory of number, geometry, which is the theory of space, and astronomy, which is the application of the theory of space. There are 3 different meanings of the words grammar, logic, and rhetoric as they are used in classical education. So the first meaning would be each thing as its own subject. For example, we all learned grammar when we were in elementary school. Perhaps you took a class on logic. Perhaps you took a class in college or high school on rhetoric. And so they're their own subjects. That's the first, well, one of the 3 meanings. And then the other meaning, or the second meaning or another meaning, is that each subject or each discipline has its own grammar, logic, and rhetoric that build off of each other. And that is explained on pages 12 and 13 in the Veith and Kern book, which I'll show you a picture of in just a moment. So I'm reading now out of Veith and Kern about a second meaning for the terms grammar, logic, and rhetoric. The trivium is a paradigm for the mastery of language, but it applies to far more than language. Every subject has its grammar, logic, and rhetoric. To be educated in any discipline, you must 1, know its basic facts, grammar, 2, be able to reason clearly about it, logic, and 3, communicate its ideas and apply it effectively, rhetoric. Put another way, every type of learning requires knowledge, grammar, understanding, logic, and creativity, rhetoric. The classical trivium anticipates contemporary educational psychology, which postulates 4 higher order thinking skills. 1, data accumulation, grammar. 2, analysis, logic. 3, decision-making, logic and rhetoric. And 4, communication, rhetoric. Every academic discipline requires mastery of its trivium. For instance, the grammar of science is comprised of its foundational facts, basic models, essential discoveries, and standard procedures. The logic or dialectic of science is the mastery of scientific method and experimental design. The rhetoric of science represents original research that addresses an unknown. The historian who's proficient in his discipline's trivium knows essential historical facts, grammar, can make sense of them by identifying causes and consequences, logic, and it will apply his, for example, historical insights to related or current events, rhetoric. A computer scientist learns the grammar of operating systems and comprehends the logic of the technology before he writes original programs that organize and present data in new ways. Every field, music, psychology, literature, and engineering, has its trivium. The trivium is not an attribute of classical education because it embodies an archaic principle of organizing knowledge. It is classical because it is a universal paradigm for learning. So we have 2 meanings of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. 1 is each thing as its own subject. 2 is the grammar, logic, and rhetoric of each subject or discipline. And then there's a 3rd meaning of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And that was something that was written about in Dorothy Sayers' essay. And that is grammar, logic, and rhetoric applying to stages in children's development. So the trivium as stages. In 1948, Dorothy Sayers, who was an author, wrote an essay called The Lost Tools of Learning. And in that, she talked about the trivium. She talked about different things, but she talked about the trivium as stages. So she says, the 3 stages. My views about child psychology are, I admit, neither orthodox nor enlightened. Looking back upon myself, since I am the child I know best and the only child I can pretend to know from inside, I recognize in myself 3 stages of development. These, in a rough and ready fashion, I will call the poll parrot, the pert, and the poetic. So she's now going to match up grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Grammar to poll parrot, logic to pert, and rhetoric to poetic. Okay, the latter, poetic, coinciding approximately with the onset of puberty. The poll parrot stage is the one in which learning by heart is easy and on the whole pleasurable, whereas reasoning is difficult and on the whole little relished. At this age, one readily memorizes the shapes and appearances of things. One likes to recite the number plates of cars. One rejoices in the chanting of rhymes and the rumble and thunder of unintelligible polysyllables. One enjoys the mere accumulation of things. The pert age, which follows upon this and naturally overlaps it to some extent, is only too familiar to all who have to do with children. It is characterized by contradicting, answering back, liking to catch people out, especially one's elders, and the propounding of conundrums, especially the kind with a nasty verbal catch in them. Its nuisance value is extremely high. It usually sets in about the lower 4th. The poetic age is popularly known as the difficult age. It is self-centered. It yearns to express itself. It rather specializes in being misunderstood. It is restless and tries to achieve independence. And with good luck and good guidance, it should show the beginning of creativeness, or reaching out towards a synthesis of what it already knows, and a deliberate eagerness to know and do some one thing in preference to all others. Now, it seems to me that the layout of the trivium adapts itself with a singular appropriateness to these 3 ages, grammar to the poll parrot, dialectic to the pert, and rhetoric to the poetic age. So we're talking about grammar being approximately elementary, approximately through grades 4 or 6, and then the junior high age being the logic stage, and then the rhetoric stage being the high school years. So she wrote that essay, Dorothy Sayers did, in 1948. In 1991, Douglas Wilson published the book Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, an Approach to a Distinctly Christian Education. And he talked about his school, classical school, Logos Academy, and then also explained Dorothy Sayers' thoughts to a much wider audience. After reading his book, many people started Christian classical schools. Later in 1999, Susan Wise Bauer published The Well-Trained Mind. And this is used by many, many classical homeschoolers. In all cases, these are folks who follow the trivium as stages. There is a lot of memorization in the grammar stage, the elementary years. The classical educators will say that whatever can be committed to memory should be committed to memory, even if the students don't know, what that knowledge is for. They should memorize it, and then they'll be able to work with higher level skills with that knowledge later on during the logic and rhetoric stages. Probably an extreme example of this is that your child can get from Memoria Press the Winston Churchill Award if your child recites all 70 stanzas of Horatius at the Bridge from memory, which you can go onto that site and hear students reciting. And that's called the Winston Churchill Award because that was a poem that Winston Churchill liked when he was young. So there is a lot of memorization in the grammar stage, and then they build off of that in the logic and rhetoric stages. So I've been talking about the Vieth and Kern book. So there it is, Classical Education, the Movement Sweeping America. And this was written in 2001, I believe. Yes, 2001. And I'm going to go over some models of classical education that are based on the chapters in this book. So we have Christian classicism. I just talked about that with Douglas Wilson. And there's a large group called the Association of Christian Classical Schools, ACCS. And on pages 19 to 20 in Vieth and Kern, they talk about that organization. And how these schools use Dorothy Sayers' trivium as stages model. The signature of the ACCS school is its dedication to Dorothy Sayers' concept of the trivium. According to Sayers' essay, the trivium's significance is based on three enduring factors: the need to accumulate tools for learning, the process by which any subject can be learned, and the developmental stages of a child's growth. Sayers asked, is it not the great defect of our education today that although we often succeed in teaching our pupils subjects, we fail lamentably on the whole in teaching them how to think? She explained that the elements of the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, are not subjects. They are tools of thinking. Sayers observed that the medieval school taught the trivium in order to, quote, to teach the pupil the proper use of the tools of learning before he began to apply them to subjects at all, end of the quote. She explained that students in medieval schools first learned the grammar of a language and then were instructed in dialectic. For example, they were taught to use language by defining terms, constructing an argument, and detecting logical fallacies. Finally, they learned to express themselves elegantly and persuasively. Specific subjects, the quadrivium, were taught only after students had shown they could master the tools of learning. For Sayers, the power of the trivium was found in its progression and completeness. To this, Sayers added her own progressive insight that the sequence of the trivium complements human development. Its three component parts correspond to three stages in a child's growth. This is not a chapter in the Vieth and Kern book, but actually one of the authors of the Vieth and Kern book, Jean Edward Vieth, is very active in the Lutheran classical movement, as is his wife, Jacqueline Vieth. If you are Lutheran and interested in classical schools or classical homeschooling, you'll want to check out the CCLE. And another individual who's very active in that is Cheryl Swope. So I read from them the Handbook of Classical Christian Education, which is a compilation of their journal articles, as well as the Curriculum Resource Guide. The reason that I did not know about this being a large thing in Lutheran schools, that there's a lot of Lutheran schools doing classical education, is because I'm in a bit of a different church body than the one that has the main classical focus. So the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, or LCMS, is the church body that has the most classical schools, it's my understanding. This is where it really started. They even have some of their Concordia universities, which are connected with them, have some classical programs for those who want to be classical teachers. So that's where it started. And I'm in a similar church body. I'm a member of the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, and there seems to be maybe some homeschoolers using classical models, but they're, as far as I know, are not classical Wisconsin Synod schools yet. But you're definitely, if you're interested in Lutheran Classicism, going to want to check out the CCLE website. Democratic Classicism. So Mortimer Adler and the Paideia proposal. This was before my times, but there was the Great Books before my time, but this was the Great Books movement and the Great Conversation. So if you've heard of that, that would be considered part of classical education. And there's a lot of available online about these things. Moral classicism, if you're interested in that, you would look for the book Norms and Nobility by David Hicks. I did not read that book. Liberating classicism. So here in the Vieth Kern book, they talk about Marva Collins, and she founded Westside Prep in Chicago. She had first found it in her own home. She was teaching a school in her own home with high expectations. She had a lot of high expectations for kids and cared about them a lot and used the classics to teach. So she kind of became famous when she wrote a letter into a newspaper saying that was responding to a story about how many young adults don't know about Shakespeare. And she said, well, my elementary students know about Shakespeare and have studied that. So she kind of got really famous really fast, but she's no longer with us. She leaves a lasting legacy of folks who are inspired by her story, as well as she authored a phonics program. And I didn't read her books, but I read The School That Cared, which is an ethnography of actually a Marva Collins school in Cincinnati. And it is current. So this is a 2020 book. So that was really interesting to me to read about a book that was based on, to read about a school that was based on her thoughts and ideas and what she had done. Now, I feel like at this point, though, I do need to point something out about how what she did kind of got blown out of proportion. So I saw the Marva Collins movie, and at the end, they say, at the end of the first year, all of Marva Collins' learning disabled students grew by 5 or more grade levels. And for a child to grow by 5 grade levels during one school year is incredible. And for all of the kids to grow by 5 or more, so 5 being the minimum. So how many grade levels are we talking about? 7, 10, 100? For all of them to grow by that many grade levels is unbelievable. And that's because it didn't happen. So I am not in any way trying to tarnish Marva Collins' legacy, but the one time that there was data, pre-test and post-test done, as evidenced in this, or as reported in this article, The Real Marva Collins Story, Truth, Myth, or somewhere in between, it was found that the kids in 1 year made a little over a year in reading and a little under a year in math. And that is average progress. So again, not trying to tarnish her reputation or legacy. Somehow this whole thing got blown out of proportion and was then used against public school teachers to say, well, she could get them to grow by 5 years in 1 year. So why can't you do that? Well, because it didn't happen. This article came out in 1982. So it's not like this is new information, but the story has kind of just taken on a life of its own. I know she was asked to be Secretary of Education by Ronald Reagan. They wanted her to be the in charge of this public schools where she was. But anyway, or it might have been a different city. I don't remember who asked her to be the superintendent of schools. But anyway, my point is that I don't appreciate that story being used against public school teachers, because I think of my colleagues that I've worked with, just even thinking about African-American women teachers that I've worked with, some of whom are still in school, some of whom are retired, some of them whom are no longer with us on earth, who will not be able to have their stories told, even though they cared about kids and worked very hard for them too. So I just do need to point that out because I just couldn't let that pass. On the bottom there, classics are in session. Anika Prather joins Good Faith Effort. This is a really interesting podcast that I definitely recommend. So Anika Prather is a professor and author, and she has written a book about the Black intellectual tradition. In fact, that's what it's called, and the classics. And this discussion on Good Faith Effort, the podcast is hosted by an Orthodox Jewish rabbi. This discussion is very interesting because they talk about some of the complexities with the history of classics in the Jewish community and with African Americans, and still come down on the side that we should that all communities, all individuals should still study the classics, and they explain why. So I definitely recommend accessing that podcast. For Catholic classicism, the Ethan Kern mentioned the Colby Academy, and there are many more. So you could look online to find Catholic classical schools that are, either in person or online. And there was a recent article in U.S. Catholic called "Is Classical Education the Future of Catholic Schools?" For homeschooling, there's a lot of resources. So a lot of folks follow the Susan Wise Bauer well-trained mind model. A lot of homeschoolers use the great books and Socratic dialogue. And then there are tons of companies that publish classical resources for homeschoolers. So Memoria Press is a big one with Martin Cothran, Classical Academic Press with Christopher Perrin, and many more companies. And then within homeschooling, there's disagreement about Charlotte Mason and about classical conversations. So some people say classical conversations is classical. Other folks say, no, it's kind of a gateway, but it's not truly classical. It's pseudo-classical. Some people say Charlotte Mason is classical, some then is more classical than other folks who say they're classical. Others say she's not. So that's not something I really looked into, but I kept seeing that come up over and over. So if you're a homeschooler, that's something you might want to look into. Secular options. This is also not a chapter in the Ethan Kern book, but I thought it would be helpful to folks. Great Hearts Academy is a classical school, as are the Hillsdale schools through the Barney Charter School Initiative. Charter schools are not allowed to take a religious stance. So if you see a classical charter school, that is going to be more of a secular option. Now, I did ask about secular curriculum because it seemed like, I guess because I started with the Lutheran Christian, looking into that kind of classical education, I was getting a lot of Christian classical materials. So I asked on a group called Classical Education about secular classical curriculum. I did get 38 replies on a Facebook post that I wrote. So apparently there's a lot of resources for secular classical education. And even some of these companies like Memoria, which publishes Christian materials, also has a secular line for the charter schools and for folks who want to homeschool, but without the Christian materials. Something I found on my own is My Graduation Speech by Neil Postman. That's 15 minutes. And I think that kind of explains classical education, but without any religious references. So at this point, I had read 9 books on classical education, and I will post the information about the books I read down in the comments underneath this video on YouTube. I had gone through the modules of 2 Christopher Perrin courses on something called Classical U, which is online, where you can go through these courses. There's various modules you can do at your own pace. I had read various articles and had seen many videos. And I had asked the folks in the classical education Facebook group for for what they thought was the best video that I could just say, here's a video about classical education that I could send to people so that they would understand it more. And I kind of narrowed it down. I was looking for something that wasn't too explicitly Christian, because I have a broad audience, including my fellow public school teachers. And I had narrowed it down. I was looking at the Catherine video, maybe something by Christopher Perrin, show some short videos that talk about classical education. So I thought at this point, I really have a good overview. Of course, I'm just kind of scratching the surface. I've only been at this for a few months, but at this point I thought, okay, I've got the gist of what this is. But then this. I was being fed many videos on YouTube about classical education, and YouTube started to feed me some videos by William Michael. William Michael is the founder of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, which is Catholic. He has a lot of videos on YouTube, and he started talking about what he calls the fake classical education movement. And all of his red flags of fake classical education are what I had just learned were classical education. So he talks about a red flag, something that you should look out for is when people talk about the trivium as stages. Another red flag is when they talk about the great books. Another red flag is when they talk about what is good, beautiful, and true. Well, I had just learned that those are some of the hallmarks of classical education. So I was a bit confused, but I listened to a lot of his videos, and I found it interesting that he was critiquing the two. He has different videos in which he critiques each of the two finalists I had for videos that describe classical education. He critiques Martin Cothran's What is Classical Education video and Christopher Perrin's What is Classical Education video, and points out what he believes their errors are. He believes that this fake classical education movement, as he calls it, is just trying to sell people books and has nothing to do with how what he called the great men and saints actually learned in classical times. He also critiqued or had critiques of different videos. One was by a school that talked about the stages, the trivium as stages, and then said, this goes back to the time of Plato and Aristotle. Well, that's not true. So he points out where folks are kind of misleading people, or maybe the people who make the video and who are starting the schools do not know that was a 20th century thought from Dorothy Sayers. He also criticizes a Hillsdale video, and he talks about what he does is play the video and talks about it as stops and talks about where he sees the errors. And one of the things in the Hillsdale video is that young people kept pledging allegiance to the flag, the United States flag, a lot in this video. And he said, so that's what classical education is, pledging allegiance to the flag every 10 minutes. Now, to their credit, I did watch quite a few of the Hillsdale videos later, and they call their model of classical education, they call it American classical education. So they are saying we've also have this, new modern American history and world history, and things like that added on. So in no way were they really saying that this is the way that Aristotle pledged allegiance to the flag of the United States of America or anything like that. But William Michael kind of contrasts what he does in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy with what is done in the other liberal arts, in the other classical education, with the other classical education companies and schools. By the way, he does also believe that the Protestant Reformation and the scientific revolution actually is what destroyed classical education. And his book, Understanding Classical Catholic Education, traces classical education from ancient Israel to the present day. So this is what William Michael says about what the other folks are doing with classical education. Oh, he's talking about the Dorothy Sayers trivium as stages. Now, while such a scheme may have impressed ignorant modern educators and parents who were zealous for something that appears to be better than was available at the modern schools, a sound knowledge of educational history clearly proves this to be a novelty itself and no return to classical liberal arts education, no return to the original path. If the proponents of Sayers' views would have presented it as such, then that would have been fine. However, it was hailed as a return to classical education and sold as a return to tradition. The system was called the trivium, and it was directly claimed that what Sayers proposed was what Christians of past generations knew as classical education. Images were used of Aristotle, Socrates, and Cicero, and there were references to early Christians like St. Paul and St. Augustine. The final product has greatly misled Christian families who have been told and believed that their children were receiving a Christian education similar to that of the saints of past generations. And I remember he says, they're trying to sell you that this is, and I misspoke earlier. He says that this is what wise men and saints did in the past, and that's just not true. So that's what he says on page 95, actually. And then on 96, he contrasts this with what he does in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. The Classical Liberal Arts Academy, CLAA, was not designed to emphasize a certain element of traditional schooling or to promote some new textbook series. It was designed to unapologetically restore the classical liberal arts curriculum that was used throughout history. Because our program so directly depends on the actual historical arrangement, we do not need to say anything of its philosophical or curricular details. If you know the classical liberal arts curriculum of the past, you know the CLAA. In fact, we have not even changed the study materials, but seeking to first return to the point of departure, judged it to be most wise to begin with what was last used by the classical European schools of the 17th to 18th centuries and gain experience with it before seeking to produce anything of our own. We are not wiser in our generation than those educators were who stood at the end of centuries of practical teaching experience. The thought of authoring our own materials at this point in history is ridiculous. We simply must concentrate on getting back to the right road. So I was kind of surprised to see that what I had learned was classical education is actually not agreed on by everybody. And then I checked, or I also was a member of this classical education Facebook group. It's actually called Classical Education. And they have a podcast. So I read a lot of their posts and listened to the podcasts. And they refer to those who use this trivium as stages as neoclassical or new classical. Now, I have not seen any folks who use the trivium as stages embrace the term neoclassical. The closest I've heard is as some folks refer to themselves as modern classical. So neoclassical is what those who are against using the trivium as stages use to refer to those who use the trivium as stages. The founder of the Classical Education Facebook group wrote, "Here are 3 books that are excellent sources to show the tradition of classical ed. These are more important than any modern book on classical education. Please go to the sources instead of reading modern authors." Oh, I just literally read 10 books by modern authors. The modern authors, for example, Wilson, Bauer, Bortons, all Sayersian, are gravely mistaken about the poll parrot, Sayersian grammar stage. Please go to books with real sources that point you to the tradition if you really want to know what the tradition of classical education is. So, who defines classical education? That's an open question. One reference that you may want to access is this report by the Manhattan Institute about test scores of various classical schools. And within that, they talk about curriculum and the model of the school, and it's many different things. So not everybody is using the Dorothy Sayers stages. Not everybody is teaching Latin. So it's different folks are using the term classical to refer to not always the exact same things. Why investigating classical education has been hard for me is because as a public school teacher, I am not comfortable being the villain in this story. And I am not comfortable with my colleagues, past and present, being the villain in this story either. Um, some folks in the classical education movement kind of go out of their way to say we're not attacking public school or public schools or public school teachers, and others just go for it. they say all sorts of things about public schools and public school teachers, especially the videos that are advertising for specific schools. And it's hard for me because classical education is supposed to focus on what is good, beautiful, and true. And a lot of the things that they are saying are not even true. So that can be difficult. They may be true in one context, but not every individual in every public school in America is having the exact same experience. And then a lot of things that they talk about, like states that have adopted the Common Core state standards, or public schools test too much. That really has nothing to do with the public school teachers. We did not decide that. So that is something that comes from the legislative and executive branches of state and federal government. So then in that case, like every voter is equally responsible for that. So I did feel like there was a lot of dumping on public school teachers, and I kind of had to steel myself every time I read something or watched a video just in case that came up, which it did often. So I think those of you who are classical educators are really at your best when you are explaining what you do and why that's good for kids, rather than trying to put other people down. So classical education may include these things. This is the slide that I showed earlier. And there's a lot of diversity of thought within the classical education movement. So for example, I was reading from one author that who felt that the great books movement was a dumbing down of classical education because the great books were being read in English and not in their original languages. So there's a lot of diversity of thought within the movement. I have some good questions. I guess I have a few questions, but these are the big ones that I think other people might have too. And of course, people can ask questions below this video, and people can answer questions below this video. Those of you who have more than 3 months of experience with classical education knowledge. The quadrivium. I don't really understand the quadrivium. I saw a chart that says that the quadrivium is begun in 11th and 12th grade. But my understanding is that the quadrivium are the math and science subjects. And then I obviously we're teaching like arithmetic and things like that beforehand, right? Or are there folks who are just teaching the trivium, just the language, all the way up to 11th grade? And then if it is something that is supposed to be later on, the textbook companies are selling astronomy courses for kids, like elementary school age kids. So are they doing it wrong? I don't really understand the quadrivium. And then Martin Cothran said that astronomy and music theory could be replaced by algebra and calculus. So then I think, well, what else can be replaced? So it's just something that I don't understand. So I'd love to hear more about that. I do understand where I could send folks if they came to me with questions about homeschooling, either secular or Christian. Yes, there's tons of resources on that. I do understand where I could send folks if they were interested in enrolling their kids in a classical charter or private school, or even starting one on their own. There's tons of resources where I could direct them there. I don't understand how classical education would fit in the public school system. So that is something I'd like to know more about. Specifically here in South Dakota, being a teacher in a public school in South Dakota, what is the plan for South Dakota? And then, is classical education for everybody? This is something I thought about as I was reading through, especially Douglas Wilson. He talks a lot about that you have to do this in an area where he says parents are actually doing their job. And he says you cannot do it in the inner city. So he's talking about a place where parents are going to be involved and parents have money to do this. So then he also talks about corporal punishment and expelling students. And he says that we in the public schools don't expel students because we have a socialist utopian vision of public education, that we want it to be like an earthly utopia. And so then I don't understand in a classical school where some of my current students would fit in. So, for example, we have students that are emergent bilinguals. I know, and one of the criticisms is that we in public schools have too many people. We have extra staff. So when we have an emergent bilingual student, a student from out of country coming, perhaps as an unaccompanied minor, perhaps as somebody who was put on a bus and then their family got off either at the where they were what was supposed to be the final destination or somewhere on the way, those students come to public schools. And when a student comes, we give that student English language development in speaking, listening, reading, and writing. We have 5 years to try and get that student up to grade level with academic vocabulary. So that student is pulled out by an ELL teacher to teach English language development. The student may be pulled out for English or reading skills, math skills, if that is needed. And then we also have counselors who help those students. It's also not an exaggeration to say that we are serving in public schools kids who have needs that would have made them be institutionalized just a few decades ago. So when we have students who have extreme behavior needs or they have intellectual needs, those students are given extra staffing. There are individuals who work with those students in addition to the classroom teachers. So it sounded to me that in the classical schools, they do not believe in that. So I'm not sure how some of the students that I serve now would fit into a classical school. And maybe people do have answers for that and could put that in the comments. And then what I read, and it may again be because of how I started this process of looking into this, it seemed like when the materials were not explicitly Christian, they were at least like Republican. So I would love to hear from Democrats, those with more progressive, who see themselves as with having more progressive political leanings, talk about if they have had some experiences in the classical schools or doing classical homeschooling or whatever. So I'd love to hear from folks who I've just mentioned or anybody else about how classical education has worked for them and other resources that we could access. One book that I'm definitely going to go back to because it's how I got started and it just blew me away. And I thought, this is it. This is it. This is why we have to do Lutheran classical education in our home, is Simply Classical, A Beautiful Education for Any Child. And that is by Cheryl Swope. Cheryl Swope also wrote a classical education curriculum for students who have, I think, especially intellectual disabilities, but for students who are going to need to go through the classical, who would go through these things, the classical education at perhaps a slower pace and would need more repetition. So that is available through Memorial Press, but she educated her twins at home. They are now adults. They had multiple intense disabilities, and it was just a really beautiful story about how this classical education can be a benefit to anybody and to everybody, to every human being. And so I recommend that book. But then again, she did do this in the homeschool environment, and not everybody can homeschool. So that's where some of my questions came in there. I am adding this addendum. I call it the E.D. Hirsch addendum. This is part of my bookshelf, and you can see I have quite a few E.D. Hirsch books. So I am a bit obsessed with this 94-year-old man's thoughts. And I appreciate the work that he's put into helping all Americans. And he especially wanted to focus on those who don't always have access to everything that folks with money have. access to. He wants all Americans to have a common body of knowledge that they know and understand. And he, in addition to writing all these books, I got started with The Schools We Need. He also has the what your blank grader needs to know. So like what your first grader needs to know, what your second grader needs to know. It starts at preschool and goes up through sixth grade. So I have up through third grade because our eldest is in third grade. And I think it was about the first grade or second grade book where I started to see things that I did not know. And if you think, oh, wow, then I would say read this book. There's quite a lot in it. It has American history, world history, music, art, math, science, and more, literature. And in fact, when I saw the Memorial Press award, the Winston Churchill Award for kids who memorize all 70 stanzas of Horatius at the Bridge, I wouldn't have known the significance of Horatius at the Bridge if I hadn't had read with my second grader. I think it was about Horatius at the Bridge. So, when E.D. Hirsch is not thought to be classical, he at least gets like an honorable mention from the classical folks. Please comment below about things that you believe I've misrepresented or other things that you'd like people to know about classical education. And I will also post the books that I read down there and some of their tables of contents. I really thank you for your time and kind of following me on this little journey through what I've learned so far about classical education. And I wish everybody the best. Thank you.